Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella, and George Pink will join me again as we unpack today's verse. It's all about money.
Do you want to be truly rich? You already are if you are happy and good. After all, we didn't bring any money with us when we came into the world, and we can't carry away a single penny when we die. That's the TLB version of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 and 7.
So before we get into today's episode, I thought I would share with you my own personal journey with money. So growing up, money was often in short supply. My family immigrated from India to New Zealand in 1995, and jobs were really hard to find. My dad especially experienced a lot of racism, even though he was highly qualified, had to re-qualify, and times were tough, really, really tough. I wasn't fully aware of it. My parents did a great job of shielding it from us as we grew up, but I think I began to fully understand our situation when I was around 9, 10, 11. Like, you just begin to learn that other kids in the playground can afford things you can't. Their clothes look a lot newer. They do things like vacations. We didn't do that. We went to go visit some family friends on weekends. That's what we did. And my parents did a fantastic job of shielding us from it, but I did definitely understand the fact that money was something that if you had a lot of it, life seemed better. And if you didn't, life is tougher. So I developed a bit of a scarcity mentality. When things financially shifted for us as a family and I began to work and I had my own income, I flipped between spending it like no tomorrow, treating myself, or I would just save so much and I wouldn't spend a single dollar. Either way, money had a lot of power over me because I never really understood it, I guess. And here I am now, 29 years old, recently got married, and I'm having to unlearn a lot of things, but mostly I'm having to learn God's way of handling money. And if I'm honest, that's a scary thing for me because money has always seemed like this thing that has so much power over your life. And I've never quite felt equipped enough to manage it. It's always felt like it's managed me. So there we go. That's a little bit of my story, where I am right now. And, you know, if you're in the same position, I think you'll really resonate with today's conversation around money. Well, happy Friday. I have got George Pink again here with me. George, so good to have you.
Thanks, Joyce. So good to keep coming back. Thanks for having me all week.
It's been really good. We've had lots of great conversations. It's been really good to also get to know you and your journey. Now, for someone who's just started listening in, do you mind just sharing a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, so very briefly, I am a priest. I'm an ordained minister in the Anglican Church in New Zealand, and I'm also a broadcaster. So like you, Joy, I do radio shows and I make podcasts.
Such a fun life. Highly recommend. We're taking a look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 to 7. It's about being truly rich. George, what are your first impressions around this verse?
My first impression is that this verse contains quite a countercultural idea, because if we think about it, this is not the way that our society actually works. You know, we want to be truly rich, a lot of us, but we don't think about richness in the way that this verse is talking about it. It talks about if you're truly rich, if you're happy and good. And if we look up other translations of this verse, they talk about true godliness with contentment is great wealth. And I think that word contentment is quite helpful. I think it's significant because it's about being happy with what we have, and that is quite a countercultural idea, certainly in a 21st century Western society, right?
Yeah, to be happy with what you have. Very hard to do when you're constantly told you don't have enough.
Yeah.
Or you need more of stuff. Yeah, I agree. It is quite a countercultural message, which I think is kind of like, I'm not surprised because the way God operates and the way Jesus lived his life while here on earth was countercultural back then and still is. It's just such a beautifully different and radical way of life. What does this verse tell you about who God is or what matters to him?
I think it tells me that what he values is quite different to the stuff that we often value. And I'm thinking specifically about the example of money because, you know, it's very common in our society really to define ourselves by the balance of our bank account. As bad as that sounds, but I was watching the news recently and they were talking about a really rich person and they talked about how much that individual was worth.
Their net worth?
They talk about this person being worth however many billions of dollars they happen to have. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. Someone's bank balance has nothing to do with their worth.
Yeah, it's hilarious. Not hilarious, but it's interesting, the shift, right? Because I've noticed over the last couple of years as well, like I'll be watching a TV show or a movie and I'll Google like the name of an actress or an actor. Before it was like their name or a movie or something, but the first option in Google now is name net worth.
Wow.
Like as the first option. And yes, I do click on it because I'm a little curious, but probably feeding the beast myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad though, isn't it? Because the irony is that it's not ultimately what makes us happy or content anyway. Being rich with money is not what it means to be truly rich. And so I like this verse that we're looking at because it tells me that this different perspective, this countercultural perspective, actually that's probably God's perspective too.
Yeah, and speaking of different perspective, you've got a really powerful story of that first experience of seeing extreme poverty for the first time. Do you mind sharing a bit about that?
Yeah, so this was about 10 years ago. I had the privilege of traveling to the Philippines with an aid organisation, and it was a pretty eye-opening trip, to be honest. As you say, it was my first time seeing extreme poverty in real life. And I just remember so clearly visiting the slums of Manila. It was an experience unlike anything I'd been faced with before. I actually just searched my Facebook page and I found a post that I had written from my time there because I remember posting something, and this was in 2013. And I'll read it to you. It says, "I'm posting this status from the middle of a Manila slum. It's an unreal experience. The stench of poverty is strong as we walk the rubbish-strewn path between the houses, which aren't much more than boxes suspended over a filthy river. What I can't get over, though, is the joy of the people here. Each one smiles and waves or wants to shake your hand as you pass them. Some proudly invite you into their homes. Despite their circumstances, they seem so happy. It's pretty incredible. I'm learning a lot." So that's what I posted on Facebook 10 years ago from the middle of that Manila slum. And it comes to mind, and I share it now because I think it really sums up this idea that we've been talking about out of that verse, And in those words from 1 Timothy, Paul saying that true richness comes from contentment, not how much money we have or the stuff we own. And I feel like actually I've seen that in real life in that Manila slum, because the people there, they would seem to have nothing really, nothing from a material sense. But, I just knew from looking at them and seeing the smiles on their faces that actually they had a lot more than what we have. They had everything that mattered, and that's because they were content.
For you, when you were there having this experience, seeing all of this for the first time, how did that change things for you?
Well, I think it was a challenge at the time, and actually in the 10 years since, when I think of it, it's still a challenge. It's so easy for our expectations and our sort of approach of life to be defined by the culture we happen to find ourselves in. And, my life here in Auckland, New Zealand is very different from the life of those people in that Manila slum. But actually, I just knew in that moment that I could learn a lot from them. And as I think about it, it's a lesson I need to keep in mind. It's an ongoing challenge.
For that person right now who is struggling to be content, right? Maybe you're listening to this podcast right now and you're like, yes, I know I should be grateful for what I have and I should be grateful with what God has blessed me with, but it's just really hard right now. What would be your thoughts or your encouragement for that person?
I think for all of us in that situation, perhaps it's helpful to keep in mind that God values us for who we are. We are priceless individuals made in His own image. He values us not for what we do or what we have, but fundamentally for who we are. And if we can keep spending time in relationship with God, reading His Word, time in prayer too, actually it might help us hold that perspective a little bit more. We might find our way towards some more true contentment.
I think something that I'm learning about when it comes to money is this link between money and value, and how my value, as George mentioned, is in God. And it doesn't matter how much money I have or don't have. That doesn't change, because a dollar sign does not determine my value, as much as the world wants us to think. However, the Bible does talk about money a lot, because I think God knows that if we're not careful, we can let it run our lives. In fact, there are more than 2,300 verses on money, wealth, and possessions. And when Jesus spoke and preached to the crowds, he spoke on money about 15% of the time. That's a huge portion. It was one of his most talked about topics. The application for today's verse is really simple. It's getting honest with yourself, getting honest with God, and truly asking yourself, do I have a healthy relationship with money? Or is this an area of life that I need to invite God into today? Well, that wraps up today's episode of the Everyday Joy podcast, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 to 7. I'll be back on Monday with some fresh episodes. I'll catch up with you then.